Hello and welcome to the Finger Lakes Community College observance of Veterans Day. I am Terrence Dominguez-Hover, president of the Student Veterans Organization here at FLCC. I served in the U.S. Army as a specialist in the 4th Infantry Division, Field Artillery. I completed my active duty contract in 2018 with one deployment to Kandahar, Afghanistan in 2016. It is my pleasure to welcome students, families, guests, and community members to today's ceremony. I'd like to ask all who are able to please stand for the posting of the colors by the American Legion of Canandaigua, Post 256.
Left face. Prepare to post. Post. Post colors. Salute. Ready. Right. Forward arms. Right face. Forward arm.
I would like to thank the Canandaigua Honor Guard, Post 256. I would now like to introduce FLCC student singers conducted by Ines Draskovic, FLCC's professor of music, to lead us all in the singing of the national anthem. I'll ask you all to please be seated. Thank you, FLCC singers. I would now like to invite to the stage Dr. Robert Nye, president of the Finger Lakes Community College, retired colonel with 30 years of service as an infantry officer with command of in-staff positions, conducted operational deployments in the Republic of Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq, to say a few words of welcome.
Thanks, Terrence. Here, now we got it. First off, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you here to Finger Lakes Community College today as we observe and honor our students, faculty and staff, community, and veterans and their families. This day today has been celebrated at our college for 17 years in person, except for the 2 years that we were experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic, where we still continued the ceremony electronically. It's really, really nice to be back here in person. This day is one that is important to recognize and honor those who have served, those who continue to serve, and in particular, our student veterans and our active duty members who have chosen FLCC as their next steps in their career exploration. We're very proud to have received the military-friendly school since 2014, in years past with distinction in bronze, gold, and in silver. This year, silver. And what it demonstrates is the support that we provide to our students. But truly, why we're here today is to celebrate the service of our veterans. Veterans who have done their duty. Veterans who served honorably. Veterans who served their country. And veterans who served a higher calling, selfless service. That is what we honor here today. And it's a great honor to have one of those veterans amongst us, who is Chief Petty Officer Leif Herjessel, who is a 1983 graduate of FLCC. Leif is a native of Ontario County, growing up in Bloomfield and graduating from school there and attending FLCC and later SUNY Brockport. He's the father of 3 children, Nathan, Emily, and Andrew currently serves in Alaska, where he's assigned to the 11th Airborne Division, 5th Squadron, 1st U.S. Cavalry, as a designated marksman in a recon company. Leif joined the reserve in 2001 and served for 14 years, attaining the rank of Chief Petty Officer. In 2009, he volunteered for deployment to the Middle East and was assigned to serve as the Public Affairs Officer for the NMCB-18, nicknamed the Skookum Mammoth, or the Mighty Builders, from the Pacific Northwest. He deployed from May of 2010 to March of 2011, and he wears the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal with 3 awards, National Defense Service Medal, Good Conduct Medal, Overseas Medal, Afghan Service, and other awards and medals, and currently works as the town historian of Canandaigua. Would you please welcome Chief Petty Officer Leif Herjessel.
Thank you, Dr. Nye. This is a really distinct pleasure. This college has changed a great deal since I was here in 1983. We didn't have this gorgeous auditorium. And I was just reflecting after Jenny asked me to do this, and I hadn't really thought about this. Wow, it's 40 years since I graduated. Not something one thinks about a lot. To the students, when I was here, I really didn't imagine that 40 years later I was going to be standing up on a stage talking to all of you as a veteran. That was not anywhere on my radar. So I promise you, whatever you're doing here, do your best and realize that life is going to take some really interesting turns. I have a lot of stories to share, just like every veteran. Military stories, both humorous, tragic, courageous, and illustrative, were shared with me throughout my life. I grew up with World War I veterans who were still walking the streets of Canandaigua, men who had been gassed in the trenches and pounded into the mud by the incessant artillery fire that churned the landscape into a cratered hell. I was surrounded by World War II and Korean vets in my family and community. Men who had stormed the beaches, flew in flak-filled skies, conned ships through mountainous seas, worked tirelessly to keep the engine of war turning, and who trained others to live and to fight and to fight and to die. My friends were guys who waited in rice paddies, crawled in tunnels, and simply got blown up driving trucks in Vietnam. As the son, nephew, student, and neighbor of veterans, I grew up surrounded by a military culture. I became a military historian at the very tender age of 6 with a family trip to Fort Ticonderoga and Gettysburg. I took this interest to its ultimate end as an adolescent. I recreated Civil War battles as a reenactor during the bicentennial. I was steeped in the military. My daily routine growing up included watching TV news footage from the rice paddies of Vietnam. Everywhere I looked in my life, there were former soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen. As I began reenacting those battles of the Civil War in 1976, I was exposed to young men who were 10, 15 years my senior, and who, after the chaos of Vietnam, were seeking a good war. No one had thanked them for fighting the war that politicians lost. And now they sought the cleansing of a straightforward battle, even if it wasn't one that was real. As a Canandaigua town historian, it is my job to tell the stories of those who have served and often died, building, saving, and defending the Constitution of the United States. For 200 years and more, our oath has been to defend that Constitution. And that is one of the most profound and common interests I have with my fellow veterans. Regardless of our age, our branch, or the job we did while in uniform, we all took that oath. My job in the military, I was very fortunate. I got to tell the stories of other soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. I would have preferred kicking down doors, to be very honest. After 9/11, that was what we all wanted to do. But I was not a young man, and I had specific skills that the Navy wanted, and they wanted me to put them to work for them. So you do what you're told to do. And in my recent career at that point, I had also been a filmmaker. I had worked in journalism, so it kind of seemed like the right fit. Not quite as satisfying as fighting the enemy, but definitely a job that I knew I could do better than many. And like I said, we all do what our superiors tell us. You want to know something about service in Afghanistan, and I'm going to be honest. There were over 20,000, and I think it was closer to 30,000 service members on Kandahar Airfield when I was there. That means there were 30,000 perspectives. So to tell you what Afghanistan was like, we would need to put every one of those people at this podium. I'm sure Colonel Dr. Nye has his experience of Afghanistan. It's going to be different than mine. Terrence had one. He came 5 years after me, after I came home. His experience is going to be very different. What I can share is this: serving on a COP or a FOB in Iraq or Afghanistan was to be subjected to random chaos and violence. Asymmetric warfare wears down soldiers and Marines fast and creates many of the same personal problems that we saw with returning members in Vietnam, the kind that lead to severe depression. I saw the results of this, but thankfully my personal role was to tell stories. I didn't suffer the way many of my fellow veterans did. My job was to share those stories and try to help the public back home understand why we were in Afghanistan and what we were doing. And I could stand up here and I could share an awful lot, and some of it would not be positive. Some of it would make you shake your head. We had rules of engagement that really didn't always allow us to fight and win. The legacy media was often not eager to tell the truth about what was happening or why. And I had to fight to get that story told. The wells we dug for villages, the child our battalion surgeon saved from a life of street begging, the time my Seabees helped to defend a combat outpost by destroying a Taliban fortification, or the soldier whose back was blown wide open and our doc saved his life. We blasted, dozered, built, and sleptwalked through 10 months on the rock pile. I wasted some really great hours praying and thinking in the dark in a concrete T-bunker T-wall bunker, and anybody who's been to Kandahar knows what I'm talking about. We had shelters in case we had incoming rocket fire, and they were just built out of the concrete barriers that you see running down the middle of highways with a big slab laid across them. And we would have to go into those and wait until the all clear was sounded. Well, I had volunteered to do some stretcher bearing, and the only place I could rest was in one of those shelters. And I will tell you, I spent some very powerful personal time there. My battalion was scattered across Helmand Province, RC South as we called it, Regional Control South. They were doing a multitude of jobs. There were about 150 CBs that were stuck at the flag on Kandahar Airfield, which was an LSA. It was a landing field. It's very large, and as I mentioned, about 30,000 people were there. It was a multinational force. And it was hard for the CBs that were there. They were working long hours, and they weren't having a lot of direct contact with Afghanis and the world around them. We were just kind of in this enclosed environment that was American military and some of our allies. It was dark at night. It was the sky was always filled with dust. The only color was the color of plywood and the beige of HESCO barriers. It was a very draining environment, if you will. And I knew that our CBs needed a way to feel in touch with what they were doing. So I created Operation Sea Believe. And we collected school supplies for the outlawed schools for children in Kandahar City. It gave our bees a way of feeling like they were making a difference. And the supplies were smuggled into Kandahar by a Canadian civilian contractor who would distribute them to the teachers. It's very hard for me to stand up here and tell you through my experience. As I said, we'd have to march all 30,000 people past this podium. We hear a lot about combat veterans, and lately we've been paying a lot of attention to suicide in our military veteran ranks. Those suicides are often not people who were in combat. They're often people who served, came home, didn't know what to do with themselves, felt irrelevant, and lost hope. One of the stories I would share with you is about a CB who saw absolutely nothing outside the HESCO barriers of Kandahar Airfield. He slept less than 6 hours a night for the entire time. We were there 10 months. He ate MREs sitting in a Toyota pickup every night without fail. He literally worked 18 hours a day because his chief did. He missed his wife and children like crazy and was the most forgotten, bored, and overworked and undervalued CB I ever met. And he wasn't alone. There were a lot of people like that. His job was just to ensure that the trucks were filled with building supplies that were going to go out all over RC South to build combat outposts and facilities. Pretty boring job. That is what service looks like for 6 out of 10 junior personnel in a war zone. No one remembers their loneliness. There is no shared horror or victory. No medal, no pat on the back. And at home, as I mentioned, they often committed suicide because they lost hope and because no one noticed. No tunnels to towers for them. No recognition. I will tell you, one of my guys committed suicide the slow way, by the bottle. It took years. We would talk every month. He was in Washington, I was here in New York, and there was nothing I could do to help him. I could not reach him. This is why we have Veterans Day. It's easy to thank the guy with the ball cap or someone like me. I honor Veterans Day for the guys up at the hospital, the ones who kept the watch in peacetime, and the forgotten ones about which absolutely no history exists. It's so rare that you hear a story about the guy who delivered the mail. And that mail was like rare treasure. In every war, what soldiers look forward to most is the mail, hearing from home. There are no movies for them. Do you remember the orderly, a private most likely, who swept the floors? In our minds, they aren't heroic because they didn't storm ashore or drop from the sky. Most of them didn't get a voice in that matter either. Sometimes it was a blessing because they were terrible at fighting skills, or timid, or just not quick enough. But you know what? They wore a uniform and did a thing that less than 1% of the citizens of this nation have done. And that number shrinks every year. Veterans Day honors every cook, machinist mate, typist, aircraft mechanic, MP, dog handler, journalist, bosun's mate, every leatherneck and doggy, every sailor and airman. Every one of them that has an honorable discharge, whether in time of war or peace. While you remember the gallant, the brave, and the tough, I would ask you to remember the lonely, the bored, the tired, and the sick. I'm going to weave a little of my own story in. Mine started in 2001 with the collapse of the trade towers. I was 38, and my 2.5-year-old daughter was sitting in my lap as I watched the trade tower attacks unfold. In the hours immediately after the attack, I tried feverishly to put together a documentary film crew to tell the story of how upstate New York sent aid down to Manhattan. It took only a few days to see that that story was one of recovery and not rescue. The story changed, and I began to feel a need to do something I had deferred for too long. And I looked at the little girl in my lap, and I knew that someday I would have to give her a satisfactory answer about what it was like on 9/11 and what I did. It was a Pearl Harbor moment, and I had to have a good answer, and I had to set an example of a responsible citizen in a free republic. Citizens, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines have always defended this nation. I nearly joined the Army which was my dad's branch, out of high school. But in those post-Vietnam years, the Army was struggling to regain its reputation, reform policies, and rebuild itself after the fall of Saigon. I decided at the last minute that I would choose college first, and that's, as you can tell, how I ended up at FLCC. A lot of life happened after that, but I never lost that sense of responsibility, and I sensed that I had ducked a personal responsibility. I had always been an eager student of history, and especially of the American Civil War. I focused on that period of history right up until the late 1980s. And I could clearly see the sacrifice that soldiers in the 19th century made. Very cut and dried, very black and white. And they made them for the same reasons that young men would make them in later generations. Because they wanted to live up to the service of their fathers, their uncles, and brothers. This same motivation moved women in World War I and World War II to sign up and serve, to show others what we think we are made of, to serve a purpose bigger than ourselves. I felt I owed my older friends, my dad and my uncles, to take my turn at the wheel. One of my first times in uniform, I met a supply guy called an SK-1 in the Navy, a Jack of the Dust. He was a year older than me. I was just getting started in the Navy, and he was 1 year older, and he was planning his retirement. Back then, my valiant wife was pregnant with my second child, Andrew, who today serves in Alaska, training in the harshest environment there is, the Arctic. He's a saw gunner, a job he's done for over a year. Before that, he was a 240 Bravo assistant gunner for an 8-man recon team of Sea Troop, 5th Squadron, 1st U.S. Cav. He's the eyes and ears of his division. He just finished 14 days in the field at the end of October. Those temps ranged from about 20 degrees to single digits at night. And he did that in a 2-man tent with MREs and meltwater. I've done similar. But when I did it, it was in Mississippi, and it was 95 degrees, and I didn't have to walk 5 to 6 miles a day through the bush in a frozen uniform, and he literally was marching in a frozen uniform. He joined because of me, and his grandfather, and his great-grandfather, and because he believes in service. I'll add that one of his grandfathers was wearing a kilt in the trenches of World War I. Andrew has had an example set, just like I had an example set, just like most of the veterans here will tell you. There was somebody ahead of them. Andrew's very proud to serve in Alaska because in 1952, his grandfather served there. Is service today the same that it was 70 years ago when my dad was there? In my humble opinion, things have changed tectonically since 1950, and not for the good. I'm not talking about the privates and the corporals and the sergeants. Cultural change has deeply impacted service members, our worldviews, our opinions about service, and the direction our national dialogue is taking. But it has not changed how we feel about the job we did or the people we served with. A Vietnam vet can sit down with a Marine from Iraq, and they share more in common than you can possibly imagine. And they love each other like they served in the same unit in the same war. I have a kindredness with the parents of service members of all wars. I'm a Blue Star dad. And I worry. I fume over why my son has to risk World War III when so many of us have gone ahead of him with the hope that we would stop doing this. We have not had a single generation since the Revolution that has escaped war. Think about that. Every generation. The longest breaks we've had were between the War of 1812 and the Mexican War, and between the Civil War and the Spanish-American War. 30 years in both of those cases. And there were military engagements in those so-called times of peace. With that track record, we are never going to run out of veterans. I was old at 38. I had to ask for an age waiver, and I got it mostly because I'm a good writer and I could phrase my argument for an age waiver in compelling ways. Unfortunately, I was also fit. This gave me a fast track. After 15 months, I finished my manuals, a shortened reserve boot camp at Great Lakes, schoolhouse training, and leadership courses at my reserve center. I was allowed to advance past go and pick up a 2-stripe chevron, which in the Navy is the equivalent of a buck sergeant, which, by the way, is also the best rank in the United States Navy. I loved helping my fellow sailors. I embraced my rating as fast as I could, and I found myself working at Ground Zero in 2003 as a journalist attached to New York City Fleet Week. I followed it up with a job at the Pentagon as a staff photographer to the Secretary of the Navy, Gordon England, and then was attached to the Naval Media Center in Washington, D.C., which is its own kind of Ground Zero for Navy communications, marketing, news gathering, journalism, all of that. And again, I got to tell the sailors the stories of sailors and Marines, men and women who laid it all on the line. All this time I had to push myself, knowing that younger men with more time in the service were watching me. And they were watching me with a hairy eyeball, I can tell you. And they were waiting to see if I had the stuff. Could the old guy keep up? In the Navy, it is good advice that if you are not a deck rating, you had better not be the last guy across the finish line. Our deck ratings are sort of like the combat guys of the Navy. I had to be fitter than most, and I had to remain respectfully silent when sea stories were being told. And I had to be the first to volunteer for sweepers, even though my rank usually gave me a free out. I loved it, and I loved training other patriots who followed my route in the months and years to come. After 9/11, we had a lot of civilians who raised their hand to join the reserve forces, and the reserve forces immediately after 9/11 were tasked very heavily. I have many reserve friends, comrades, who served on 6 deployments. And one deployment like mine was just the rule. I have so many stories to tell and recount, but as I work as a historian, I research the exploits of young men from Canandaigua, young men who fought in the 1860s. And I am humbled, and I realize that I owe them a deep debt that I can't repay, and that my stories don't include watching men die around me. I want to share how Sergeant Charles Housel of the 148th New York charged across 800 yards of open ground in October of 1864. He was in Virginia, and his small regiment and two others tackled a frontal assault of a Confederate fortification near Yorktown. They came under artillery fire almost immediately, and as they moved faster and faster toward that position, the fire only increased. At 150 yards, they went to ground. They were physically unable to withstand the volume of shot and shell. They withdrew under the cover of darkness. Charles Housel was wounded in that attack. He died 2 weeks later, on November 11th, 1864. Charles grew up in a little hamlet just south of Cheshire called Academy. I did dodge one attack by only minutes and a few yards, and a soldier died in that attack, and 6 others, including a fellow CB chief from my battalion, were injured. The chief came within millimeters of death as shrapnel sliced through his chest, very close to his heart. But someone was watching out for me that night, and instead of going to dinner, I went to visit a friend and drop off a gift to a friend nearby. And the shell that hit that defense dining facility, we had a pre-det roof, which was essentially a reinforced roof that was meant to help the shells explode and not penetrate into the interior of the building. And unfortunately, that shell came through a vent, and it went off directly over the table of a group of service members who were having their dinner. I would have been right there. Charles Housel was preceded in death by 3 other young men from just south of Canandaigua in Cheshire, who died at the Battle of Spotsylvania. The youngest was following in Charles' footsteps for sure. It was his little brother Joseph. Also their cousin Charles Sanford and an older friend, Gould Benedict. All 3 of them were in the 4th New York Heavy Artillery. Gould was about 28. Charles Sanford was in his early 20s. And Joe Housel was probably the age of most of you guys. He was 19. Private Housel was shot in the head at Harris Farm. His cousin Chaz and his friend Gould Benedict also were fatally or mortally shot in that battle. And I would ask you, how do we repay that? How do I measure up? I missed an attack on a dining facility. God was watching over me that day. The Union that they died defending lasted for another 158 years after they fell. Is it going to last another year? Another 50? Will it last another century? Have you ever heard of 2nd Lieutenant John D. McCarthy of the 378th Fighter Squadron? I can't see Dr. Pierce. He would probably be the only person here who has heard of Lieutenant John D. McCarthy. McCarthy was flying in a formation with 15 other P-47 Thunderbolts that engaged the enemy on December 17th, 1944. As the Germans poured west in a buildup that would famously be known as the Battle of the Bulge, Lieutenant McCarthy and other American pilots tore up a massive column of German tanks and trucks. They left them in ruins. This was among the first significant counterattacks between the Allies and the Nazi forces in the weeks-long battle. Lieutenant McCarthy, bravely diving on the Germans, was caught in heavy cannon fire, and his plane broke up and exploded on impact. Lieutenant McCarthy of Canandaigua gave his life 3,500 miles from our hills and lakes. Today, we thank and we honor Charles Housel, Gene Gerard, who is 101 and is a Coast Guard veteran from Canandaigua, and so many others, the gentlemen that were in this color guard. I'm standing here as a living marker for them and for all the veterans who served. Some of them made the ultimate sacrifice, and if asked, they would surely have said, hell no. But we don't get to ask. Others were wounded in obvious or insidious ways. Others nobly stood to watch and kept the peace. Military service is an ancient, hallowed, and ugly business. We served for everyone. We still serve in our memories, in our daily actions, and we futilely hope we are the last. God bless every man and woman who has raised their right hand and strapped on a pair of boots and served in peace or war, in combat and behind enemy lines. Service in a uniform is an honor in a free republic, not a task or a duty. We are a vanishing band of brothers and sisters who are grateful to have had something worth serving. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leif. And welcome back to FLCC on your 40th anniversary. Good afternoon. It is also my honor to be celebrating with each of you in our observance of Veterans Day. It is impressive and meaningful to spend time with these non-traditional FLCC students and their families. We classify non-traditional students as 22 years of age or older, or if a student self-identifies that something on their educational journey is outside of the typical experience of going straight from high school into higher education. Speaking of non-traditional student experience, nationally, 57% of college veteran students are age 30 or older, compared to 21% of non-veteran students. 7.4% of Native American, 5.7% of students reporting one or more race, 5.6% of Black, 5.6% of white, 5.4% of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, 3.7% of Hispanic or Latino, I like to say Latinx, and 1.8% of Asian students are veterans. Student veterans were found to have a 72% success rate in higher education and average GPAs 40% higher than their civilian peers. The most common degree fields for veterans are business at 27% and health and STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics at 24%. Nearly 2/3 of student veterans are first-generation college students. We are so proud of our FLCC student veterans and their families as they continue to grow and thrive. Thank you for all that you do, and today and every day, by enriching our community and beyond. With that, we would like to take a moment to recognize all of our student, faculty, staff, and community, active military, and veterans in the audience. So as you are able, please stand to be recognized. And of course, no person is without their support system. If you are a spouse, partner, parent, grandparent, or family member of an active duty or veteran, please stand as you are able to also be recognized. Thank you. And thank you for selecting FLCC as your home for your education and for adding so much experience and vibrancy to our campuses. And with that, I would like to turn the floor back to Terrence for a very special announcement. Thank you.
Man, I'm really feeling these speeches. Thank you, Dr. Ortiz, for being a part of the ceremony today. As we conclude our FLCC Veterans Week, we have one announcement. Tonight we have Dave Coltman, also known as the Dating Doctor, here as our special guest speaker at 6 p.m. in Stage 14. There will be plenty of food, drinks, and entertainment. If you'd like to come, just stop right outside the table or right at the table right outside of the auditorium and grab a ticket for you and your family. I would like to personally thank all the speakers, those behind the scenes that make this event possible each year. We invite you all to please join today's hosts, the FLCC Student Corporation, for a dessert reception out in the hallway following this event. We will now ask the FLCC student singers to please return to the stage for the singing of God Bless America, after which the Canandaigua American Legion 256 will then retire the colors, and that will conclude today's event. I'll now ask the audience to please stand for the singing of God Bless America.
Present arms. Prepare to retrieve colors. Retrieve colors. Left face. Forward mark.
And that concludes our event. Thank you.
Thank you.